I have a couple reasons why I want to talk about Swetnam. And the first one is that it's this great, sort of simple, little effective fighting style. It's a small style. The entire book is fairly short and fairly clear, but it still works very well. Um, it also works particularly well in an essay context. A lot of period fighting styles don't necessarily reflect the scoring system or the weapons or the rules we operate under. And Swetnam's style, though, however, really does. It is pretty much exactly what, and we will talk a little bit more about why that is, why it fits into the essay context so well. It also represents a unique moment of fencing in England, that all martial arts are sort of tell a lie that they are just nothing but efficient ways for sort of murdering people. And in fact, they're really much more sort of specific than that. They're a solution to the problem of how do I win by whatever my definition of winning is against this person, the kind of person I'll be fighting, with the kind of weapons I'll be fighting with, in the circumstances I'm going to be fighting. There's a whole lot of sort of extra baggage that comes along. But at the same time, we still sort of pretend that all the solutions that they give us are logical solutions to just murdering people as quickly as possible. And one thing I like about Swetnam's style is all the bones are very close to the surface. You can see all the little seams where he has put together um, different things into a single, mostly coherent style that also says a lot about the time and the place and the person who made it. And so I'm going to take a little advantage of the fact that we are all at our computers instead of standing out in the middle of a field at an SCA event. And I'm going to talk a little bit more than I usually do when I teach Swetnam about the context and where the style comes from in a sort of logical sense. So if we sort of look at the history of rapier in England, and we sort of nail down one end by taking Agrippa as sort of the kickoff point for the rapier proper. I know that's not true. There's earlier precursors and whatnot, but let's pretend rapier starts with Agrippa. We start to see the first sort of major schools in England teaching the rapier in a couple of decades later. Rocco Bonetti comes over, opens up his fencing college in Blackfriars, and starts stealing all the good students. He has a whole bunch of Queen Elizabeth's favorites coming to his school, including Sir Walter Raleigh. He has these very noble patrons. If you look at descriptions of the school, he has like velvet curtains and a clock on the wall. And he mentions that he has a writing desk in one corner of the school so his students can carry on their important correspondence in between their fencing bouts. So this is not sort of the blue collar street exhibitions of the London Masters. And the London Masters are really not happy about this. They immediately start to push back. There's a lot of people trying to challenge him. Most famously, George Silver and his brother tried to challenge Bonetti to a fight. Bonetti, of course, was winning sort of the cultural war and didn't bother to respond. And they started following Bonetti around, trying to sort of trip into him in the street and start fights and sort of provoke him into responding, so they could prove that this foreign fencing was wrong. And they actually did this so much that Bonetti went to the council and had to request the equivalent of a restraining order to get them to leave him alone. And it was actually granted because he had all these noble patrons who could speak for him. But the thing is, at the same time, we also start to see the first sort of London rapier masters playing prizes with the new foreign weapon. And so they are both pushing back against these foreign teachers coming to teach and trying to incorporate the sexy new weapon into what they're teaching so they can be relevant and attract good students. So think of this as sort of the flashy new exercise. This is Peloton. This is Soul Cycle, whatever. So so he got the restraining order, but they still continued to press back to the point where an English fencer named Austin Bagger actually challenge is a grand word for what he did. He gets drunk with his friends and basically goes over to Bonetti's house, calls him out, and then stabs him a bunch of times. And Bonetti eventually dies of his wounds. And Austin Bagger is not a fencing master. He is referred to, I believe, as a very tall man of his hands, not standing much upon his skill. So he's sort of a goober, but just sort of a big, strong goober who's a proponent of English fencing. And this sort of act of killing Bonetti was seen as a defense of English fencing. This is pushing back and defending sort of the homeland. It didn't do any good because Bonetti's junior partner immediately takes over the school and just keeps going. And other Italian and Spanish teachers come over and teach, most notably Saviolo, and Saviolo again continues this tradition of stealing the good students. So Saviolo has Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, who's one of Queen Elizabeth's favorites at his school. But he's teaching a foreign style in London and sort of pushing sort of the boundaries of what the English rapier masters want to have going on. And the English masters are continuing to push back. So we have George Silver publishing his book. A little later, Silver's not a rapier master, but he's like Austin Bagger, sort of a proponent of English fencing, saying how bad the rapier is and calling for Englishmen to go back to throw off this foreign style and go back to their good old English weapons. Meanwhile, Italian rapiers marching on. We get Giganti and Fabris and Capoferro all being published fairly close together. And then at that moment, we start to get Swetnam. So Swetnam publishes in 1617, about 18 years after Silver. And then to sort of finish and he's teaching as an Englishman in English, the rapier. He's still teaching in an English way, and we'll see how that works. But he is teaching this foreign weapon and saying it's the best weapon. So it's a part of this sort of arc of rapier invading England. And finally, I would put sort of as a sort of arbitrary endpoint of the process, I would say the Pallas Armata, where this is the first book that's an Englishman writing in English. It's not a translation. It's not a foreigner resident in London like Saviolo. It's an Englishman writing in English, a book of what is essentially pure Italian rapier theory, of stuff that would not be any surprise to Giganti, Capoferro, etc. And so by 1639, the war is over. The rapier has won. And Swetnam is sort of 3/4 of the way through this process. He's teaching the rapier, and but he hasn't quite completely capitulated and started just teaching Italian theory. He's going to teach it in his own weird English way that borrows a lot of terms and ideas from the Italians, but isn't just Italian rapier. And to show you what this looks like in the text, so here's Silver, and he's saying Englishmen must cast off these Italianated, weak, fantastical, most devilish and imperfect fights and go back to their good old English sword, and hit people over the head with downright blows. Whereas Swetnam is saying, 18 years later, saying the rapier and dagger is the finest and comeliest weapon ever used in England. It has so much cunning, this is the best. But he's going to teach it in his weird English way. He's not completely going over. Pallas Armata has this great phrase where he says, I have fitted myself to the times. I'm not even going to bother teaching the dagger or the buckler or anything like that. Swetnam is still part of that earlier tradition of mixed weapons, and he has staff in there, and he has short sword and buckler and so on. Pallas Armata is like, no, we are modernizing. We are looking forward to our glorious sort of small sword future. And finally, to pick a really far end point, there's Zach Wilde in the 18th century who says, like, we don't even bother remembering who invented the rapier. It was the French, it was the Spanish, we don't care. It's ours now. We do the best version of it. And so the process of assimilation is complete. This is no longer going to be treated like a foreign weapon. It's just our weapon. To draw a little more comparison between Swetnam and Silver. So if you look over here under Silver's section in 1599, he's saying we're going to prove that the true fight is this short ancient weapons, how imperfect and weak the rapier is. And he's complaining that the rapier serves to kill our friends in peace, but cannot much hurt our foes in war. He's complaining about the dueling focus of the rapier. and it's not, and that it's going to be dangerous and it's going to kill our young men for no good reason. Where Swetnam is saying, no, when he has his section covering the short sword, which he feels he has to do. So this is only a few years later. He still feels the short sword has enough of a constituency out there that he has to teach it. But he says, in describing of the short sword, I shall account the time ill spent. For it is in use and warned of many that would leave off if they knew what an idle weapon it were. And again, he's acknowledging that the short sword is still popular, that he's part of this cultural assimilation, but things are not fully assimilated yet. And he actually refers to silver directly. The spelling isn't the same because spelling was not consistent at the time. But you can see his sort of skill as a pamphlet writer here, where he says, George Silver hath most highly commended that short sword and dagger, yet one swallow maketh not a summer, nor two woodcocks a winter. And without all doubt, it is more dangerous than the rapier and dagger, in that somebody who fights with a short sword must get into really close measure. And the thing I would point out is, in Silver's section, he's saying people should leave off the rapier. The rapier, again, the rapier and short swords are coexisting, but he's trying to put his thumb on the scale one way. Swetnam is saying, yep, they're still both coexisting, but he's trying to push things towards the rapier. And they're both arguing from the safety of English young men. Like, neither of them is fully into this idea that we should be having duels to the death between our own people. And Swetnam's saying, like, look, you can have safe fighting with a rapier, you just have to do it right, and here I'll tell you how to do it right. I'll talk about how that method works in a minute. So Swetnam himself, to talk about the man, so we don't know exactly when he was born. He mentions, given what he says his career was, it's somewhere probably late 1560s. He dies only a few years after the book, so like every fencing master ever, he has a bunch of points where he says, and I will cover this in my second book. And of course, there's no second book. He says that he was a soldier for 30 years. He ran fencing schools in several different British cities. And he clearly considers himself a master of defense. He actually has a whole chapter in which he says, in which he sort of admonishes other fencing masters to sort of shape up. And it's very much in the tone of somebody who is a colleague and a peer. It's not sort of, you guys need to improve. It's, hey guys, come on, you're making us look bad. Stop accidentally putting people's eyes out in exhibition fights and drinking with your students. It's all sort of very much that he considers himself a fencing master, but he's not actually mentioned in any of the London Masters of Defense paperwork. That's not unusual. The paperwork is pretty spotty, and there are like some entire decades of the London Masters of Defense roles that are lost, so who knows. And most importantly, his biggest qualification is he is the fencing master to Henry Frederick, the Prince of Wales, who himself is a super interesting figure. So this is Henry Frederick. He is the Prince of Wales. He's the son of James I of England, and he is the heir. He's the oldest son. His younger brother Charles is sort of second in waiting. The thing is, what's Charles? Let me. He is the heir. The thing is, Henry Frederick goes swimming in the Thames one day when he's 18 and catches typhoid fever and dies a few days later, putting Swetnam out of a job and leaving Charles the heir. And posthumously, Henry Frederick is remembered as the best prince ever. That like he was handsome and strong and studious, and he was a great art collector and a martial artist, and like if only he had lived, he would have been this great king. Instead of Charles, who famously becomes Charles I and gets his head cut off by Parliament for being a jerk. So it's one of these great sort of what if moments in British history, up there with what if like the Normans had lost the Battle of Hastings. If Henry Frederick had not gone swimming that day, the history of England, at least for the next century or so, would have been really different. But unfortunately, he dies and Swetnam's out of the job. The strange thing is why Swetnam has that job in the first place. Because Swetnam a very strange character to be the fencing instructor to a prince. If you think of the other people who are fencing masters by royal appointment, like Pacheco or Tabot getting commissioned to write his book, like those are really educated gentry plus social grade people. Whereas Swetnam explicitly says he is completely uneducated. He says, I've never went to school 6 months of my life. I am no scholar and have no learning, just experience. He's this sort of practical blue-collar English fencing master who is, for some reason lost to history, chosen to be the instructor to the prince. This is one of my favorite quotes in the book. This third one here is yet at both Oxford and Cambridge, I looked upon the scholars and they looked upon me, but I became a little the older, but never the wiser. So he also mentions later something like to the effect of, I was never at Cambridge any longer than it took to change my horse. So he's not an educated man. He is not a gentry in the way that sort of George Silver was, but he is apparently the person chosen to educate the heir in swordsmanship. Unfortunately, the other thing we know about Swetnam is his pamphlet, The Arrangement. So a few years before he wrote his fencing book, he wrote this thing called The Arraignment of Lewd, Forward, and Inconstant Woman. And it is the most incel screed you ever read in your life. It is terrible. You should not read it. It is just him making misogynistic rants for pages and pages. The only good, and he published it anonymously, but apparently he was quickly found out and everybody knew it was him. And the thing you should read, and which is great fun, is he sparks this entire wave of feminist backlash against The Arraignment. The Arraignment was incredibly popular. It went through something like 31 printings over the next century. It was much more popular than his fencing book. But you get this great backlash of stories and pamphlets and plays being written by women, basically calling him out for being an asshole. They have wonderful titles like The Worming of a Mad Dog, A Muzzle for Melastomus, Melastomus being a nickname for Swetnam that the author gives him. And this particular image is from a play, Swetnam the Woman Hater Arraigned by Women, where this is Swetnam here in the dock, and he's being put on trial by a group of women for being a jerk. And I love the fact that this is actually the only picture that's supposed to be a Swetnam that I've been able to find, is a picture of him being excoriated for being a dork. So don't read The Arraignment, but do read the counter literature. It's a lot of fun. It's worth saying that none of this really appears in this fencing book, fencing being a mostly male occupation at the time. Women are not mentioned very often, and when they it's not in the same kind of sort of ranty way that happens in The Arraignment. So we're just going to acknowledge that he was an asshole and sort of move past it and concentrate on his fencing stuff. So now that we've sort of talked about the time and the place and the author, I want to talk about Swetnam's assumptions about how you're fighting and who you're fighting and why you're fighting, because that has a big impact on the techniques he recommends and the way he fights. So the main thing that he's going to assume is that if you're fighting with a rapier and dagger, it's a duel, or what the term he uses is a quarrel. And that's because if this were walking around self-defense, he recommends a staff. If this were war, you'd be using other weapons. But if you're using a rapier and dagger to fight, you're probably in a duel, an arranged meeting, single combat. It is probably with someone you know. So we have this sort of notion that duels were these incredibly important sort of major events. This is like the enemy of your family who you've hated for decades, and you're going to stab him through the head, and everyone's going to cheer, and it's going to be a good thing that you did this. And Swetnam is like much lower key and much more conservative about who he thinks you're fighting. Think of it sort of on the air order of like Judge Judy. This is your neighbor. This is somebody you were drinking and gambling with in a tavern last night. This is your cousin, where you were both drunk at your sister's wedding, and he said something rude about the bride, and so you challenged him, and now you have to fight. It's not like this is some mortal enemy. This is somebody who you probably got along with last week and would have gotten along next week. And whatever duel you're having is probably happening for a dumb reason. So Swetnam is using the rapier. He's using this dueling weapon. He's assuming you're using it in the context of a duel. But he is also really dismissive of the reasons why people fight. So he has a bunch of examples of duels in his book. He has a bunch of examples of why people got into these situations, and they are all dumb. They are all on the order of you were drinking at a tavern and you bumped into somebody and they insulted you and that you were drunk and challenged them and Swetnam is not respecting the reason why you're fighting this person. But again, because if this were a real problem, if this were like defense of your country, you'd be using a different weapon. If you were, if this were a serious issue with your business partner, you would sue them. Like England's a real country. We have laws. If this were a real problem, you could solve it in a better way than a duel. And therefore, sort of by process of elimination, the reason you're on the dueling grounds is probably dumb. And Swetnam also firmly believes that there's going to be consequences for the winner. That whoever dueling is illegal, murder is illegal, and you are going to have consequences if you win this fight by killing your opponent. And even if you get away with it in the court of law, there are God will get you. And Swetnam is really clear about that God does not like murderers. God says that thou shalt not kill, and there will be consequences, and very sort of Old Testament biblical consequences if you murder someone. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So really think of this, of the reason for the fight and what's happening in the fight on the order of sort of Judge Judy. So to give you an example, so Swetnam has an entire chapter called Fearful Examples of Murder, which I feel like you need to read in sort of a 30s radio serial voice. Fearful Examples of Murder. And this is one of his examples. And so he, of course, being a period author, writes this as one giant rambling paragraph. I've split it up into 3 paragraphs that sort of illustrate the 3 sort of points about how Swetnam thinks about fights. So the first thing is, so we have this fight between 2 sea captains who both want to stay at the same lodging house. One of them was denied lodging, where the other did lie by the good wife of the house, for it may be she affected the one better than the other. So to start off with, this is a dumb reason for a fight between 2 people who are peers. The second paragraph describes the fight. It says, at the door of the street they fought, and in the first bout Traherne was down in the gutter, and Eagles there in the presence of many might have killed them, but stayed his hand and suffered him to rise again. But then Traherne assaulted Eagles most furiously, and so it chanced with a blow that Eagles' rapier brake, and then running to a house to save himself, Traherne runs him in through the back and kills him. So again, this is sort of a brawl. This is not 2 master swordsmen having an elegant duel. This is 2 people who carry swords and know how to use them, having an encounter that is not particularly a sort of showplace of skill. And finally, we have sort of the aftermath, where the winner is put on trial. He does get acquitted in this case as being defending himself. But he gets away with it. He then gets a crew of ships. He goes out roving on the coast of France, where the entire crew is taken and hanged. And Swetnam very much believes that if they had not happened to the murderous company, they would have gotten away. So this is this very sort of early Protestant Calvinist viewpoint that if you do bad things, if you sin, God's going to get you, and God's not going to be discriminating. He's going to just nuke anyone in the area, just for associating with you. Although he does also have some, Swetnam also has some examples that are more specific. He has a similar example of somebody committing a murder, running away to sea. His ship encounters a Spanish ship, which fires one cannonball that just takes off that one guy's head. As this very sort of, moralistic idea that God disapproves of murder and will get you. There will be consequences for winning this fight. And Swetnam, again, to show you I'm not cherry picking, but Swetnam does repeatedly say how dumb he thinks dueling is. He says, seldom or never any quarrel begun but in an afternoon, for then prominently the drink is in and the wit is out. Or for indeed the drinking pot is the cause of almost all quarrels. He describes people as starting duels over taking a hard hit in a fencing school. And he says, I never knew anyone to stab another, but he was very sorry for it afterwards. For the thrust being given, the blow once fallen, it will be too late then to repent. So this is a dumb thing. It is probably not worth killing people over. And if you do kill them, you're going to regret it. And so Swetnam's style is intended to manage not only the fight, but also the consequences. You don't want to just win. You want to win in a way that minimizes the subsequent wake and problems for you later on. And he strongly recommends talking it out and making up. This third quote, he says, go to the house of your adversary, don't tell anybody, and say, I am come to answer what last night I promised, yet withal to tell thee our quarrel is but small and begun upon idleness, yea, so small that I am loath to have it come to the ears of wide men, lest they account us both fools. Right? This is dumb. Can we just not do this? And this is one of my favorite quotes here. The wiser of the two may go into the other and say, come, let us go and drink ourselves friends. Let us take the hair of the same dog which last night did bite us and made us mad, shall now cure us and make us whole. So we were probably drinking. We said things we didn't mean. Yes, we agreed to fight, but this is probably a bad idea. Can we all just get a do-over? And Swetnam is, if not unique, extremely rare in fencing masters in recommending non-lethal attacks for these reasons. It's probably a dumb fight, and therefore you don't want to kill people, and killing has consequences, and therefore you don't want to kill people. So he says, thou must mark which is the nearest part of thine enemy towards thee, and which lieth most unregarded, whether it be his dagger hand, his knee, his leg, or where thou may best hurt him at a large distance without danger to thyself, and without killing of thy enemy. So this is a sniping combat style. We're not here to stab our enemy through the chest. We're going to just poke an arm. We're going to poke a leg. We're going to take first blood. We're going to declare victory, and we're all going to go home alive. And Swetnam says, why should I go into the field? When thou comest there, thou must not kill. For if thou does, they'll be forced to answer before God, and you also will be forced to answer before the law, and you might lose your goods which your wife and children should possess. Swetnam also goes so far to say that if you die in a duel, you're probably going to hell, because if you were living a virtuous life, you would not be getting into duels. And therefore, dying in a duel is particularly bad. However, he is still not a pacifist. He says, rather hurt than be hurt, rather kill than be killed. So he's not saying be reckless. He's not saying you want to let the person attack you. You want to be as safe as possible while also keeping them as safe as you can. So to give you an example of how this differs from what the Italians were sort of importing into England, Saviolo is saying when you go into a field with your friend, do not require to fight with him as a friend, but as an enemy. And you are not to think of him otherwise of his mind, but as full of rancor and malice towards you. That it doesn't matter this was your friend yesterday. Once you're on the tourney field, you should be striking to kill and assuming your opponent is doing the same. So he says, when If he'd be your friend, don't fight with him. But if you do your best, because it seems childish to say, I will go and fight, but I will spare and favor him. Where Swetnam, living in the same city, teaching with the same weapon, is saying, thou canst hurt thy enemy, yes, although it be but a little, or unarm him of his weapon, which thou mayest very easily do if thou fight with good discretion. And later on he says, then defend thyself, yet fear as much to kill as be killed. Okay, so we're trying to solve not just the combat problem in front of us, but the larger social and sort of moral problem of not killing people. So Swetnam is importing the rapier and using this dueling weapon, but he's not fully embracing the dueling culture. It's this weird sort of hybrid moment in history where he's sort of kind of there, but kind of not. He also gives quite a lot of advice about... I promise I'm almost done. I will get to the actual sword stuff in a sec. He says, if thou recovered thy enemy's weapons, do not give it back. Or if your enemy forgets to bring a weapon to the field, don't lend him one. Like, this fight is probably stupid. You have to demonstrate your honor by showing up and participating, but you should not go out of your way to put yourself in danger. So if he wants to talk, let him talk, but don't let him get close. And if your opponent, and don't assume your opponent's honor. So he gives an example of someone who asked to breathe for a break. They took a break, and then one of them suddenly charged their weapon and stabbed and runs him through. And again, we see the hue and cry of God's vengeance follows Bartlett in this example. So Swetnam is not a pacifist. He's not saying you should turn the other cheek or anything, but he is saying that the goal is to get everybody through this whole thing alive. And you'll see that reflect in the style as we go into it. Okay, so enough background, but this produces sort of these factors produce the essential features of Swetnam's style. And the first thing is that it is super simple. We're going to keep a very small set of techniques, and you're going to use the same techniques for offense and defense. And we're going to keep our engagements very short. We're not going to be out there doing lots of second intention, dink, 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 dink. We're going to reach out, dink, dink, back to guard. Reach out, dink, dink, back to guard. We're going to try to keep the chaos of the fight down as much as possible, knowing that these kind of fights are inherently chaotic. And what we want to do is simplify it so that we can win with skill and keep everybody alive. Swetnam's super cautious and defensive. We're going to do extremely slow minimalist footwork where we can't travel over the ground very fast, but we don't want to, because really we don't want to catch the other person. We want to stay safe. And so you're basically a defensive turret in Swetnam's style. And you're going to hold your dagger way far forward with a big buckler-like guard, and we're going to do these huge sweeping parries that sweep entire sectors free of attack. We're not going to try to do sort of subtle body voids that let the opponent's blade pass by an inch or something. We're going to just clear and cryer zones and stay really safe. And as we do that, we are going to have this sniping offense where we take these very short, low-risk lunges, and we're going to aim at non-lethal targets. We're going to try to take arms and knees and hands and generally whittle our opponent down until they give up and go home. So as you can see, this does fit pretty well to our SCA's rapier field, where we are fighting against our friends, we don't want to hurt them, and we want to stay safe in a messy situation against unpredictable opponents. So the weapons Swetnam's fighting with, he's fairly vague about. He mentions that this rapier should be 4 feet long and the dagger should be 2 feet. Unfortunately, Swetnam does not say whether that is the whole weapon or just the blade. If he means the blade, a 4-foot rapier would be long but not unheard of for a dedicated weapon, a dedicated dueling weapon. Same for the dagger. There were 2-foot-long dueling daggers. But if we assume that he means the entire weapon, including the hilt, a 4-foot rapier suddenly becomes about a 42-inch rapier blade, which is our standard. Same with the dagger. 2-foot dagger becomes an 18-inch dagger blade, fitting very nicely into what SCA standard. He also describes both the Rapier and Dagger as being close hilted. That means, to his mind, that there's a lot of metal there. He doesn't give a lot of specifics about what the Rapier hilt should look like. And if you look at the pictures, there's essentially no guards on any of the pictures. But he is very clear that you want a lot of metal on both your dagger hand and your sword hand. In fact, I would say that it is mandatory. You're going to be putting your dagger out in situations where it's really dangerous to have it sticking out there without a good guard, and a bunch of Swetnam's positions just don't work if you have to worry about protecting your dagger hand. So he recommending something like a sail guard dagger and a Pappenheimer shell-hilt, cup-hilt rapier. Cup-hilts are later, but they work for this. And so we are going to use these weapons we're going to use these big guards to keep our hands safe without having to add in a lot of extra moves. Okay. So when we talk about the Swetnam's stance, he has a super narrow stance where your heel of your right foot is next to your left big toe. And this is not a very mobile stance. You're going to want your thighs close together, and you're going to want to sort of suck in your stomach a little bit and lean a little bit forward. He says, the more that thou holloweth the body, the better. So we're going to sort of tuck our tummy under. We're going to keep our thighs nice and close, and we're going to cover the ground very leisurely. Like, this is not a super mobile, active stance, but that's fine. We don't want to be mobile. He's worried about tripping. He's worried about falling down. You want to be a turret in this style. Your upper body you're going to be holding the dagger and sword tips together just above your eye level. The dagger is going to be held out at full arm extension with that big guard used to protect your hand. And the sword is going to be held down, he says, by the right pocket of your hose. And you're going to keep your shoulders dead square, because we are going to trust that dagger as the primary, as your primary defense. And so we want it to be as strong as possible, and we're going to keep that left shoulder forward to give as much strength to that dagger arm as possible. And so there's the general concern with this kind of stance is that it does square up your body and present a wider target. However, that wider target compared to a sort of Italian profile stance is farther away, because you're sort of rotated back and your weight and your stomach is sort of back over your back foot rather than being sort of forward between your feet. And so it's a bigger target, but it's a little farther away, and you've got that dagger out there far ahead to protect yourself. So you are still very safe. I apologize. Pretty much the rest of this deck is going to be full of pictures of me. I promise you I am not that vain, but we are all in quarantine, so I'm the only model I have. So you are stuck with pictures of me. When you're doing full work on offense, Swetnam everything is done on a lunge when you're attacking. He is not very specific about the shape of the lunge and how you do the lunge. He just says, step forward with thy foremost foot and hand together. Step forward with thy right foot and hand together, he says. And you keep your left foot moored fast like an anchor. Note the word anchor there. Swetnam uses a lot of nautical metaphors. He's a resident of Plymouth, which is a port city. And he says explicitly, if you're fighting inside, look down at what board you stand on, and whenever you step forward, you want to keep your right foot on the same board your left foot's on. We're not going to do any lateral movement here. Well, I tell a slight lie. That's not strictly true. So there is some lateral movement. It's all really weird exceptions. The default fight is in my tight little guard. I'm stepping forward with my right hand and foot together to offend, and then popping back to that my good tight guard. On defense, Swetnam's only defensive footwork is basically doing what he calls a slip or a reverse, where you are stepping back with your front foot behind your rear foot. So you're going to step back, let the blow go past, and then step back in. And again, you're going to just step in with right hand and foot together. He doesn't give a lot of sort of examples of multiple footwork, of multiple steps inside the same action. Oop. Okay. Told me the broadcast paused. So he doesn't do more than 1 or 2 steps per engagement. He's going to step back, let it go by, step in. He also does occasionally mention doing what he calls passages, which are the same as passadas in Italian, where you're stepping in with your left foot in order to do a dagger action and then follow up with a sword action with your right foot. But his footwork is super simple. It's linear. You are facing your opponent, taking 1 step away from them, 1 step towards them. That's it. Something nice, simple, easy to remember in the heat of combat. So his general principles for defense. You're going to use your dagger for defense and your sword for offense. Your sword, there's almost never a time when you are going to make blade-on-blade contact with your rapier in Swetnam style. That dagger is going to do 90% of the work. And you're going to stick it way out there, and you're going to do big parries at full extension, where you just clear entire zones. We're not going to do subtle. We're just going to sweep entire quadrants clear. And I'll show you what that means in a moment. And as you do that, you're going to reach out with your sword and make a low-risk counterattack next to your dagger. And I'll show you what that looks like as well. But again, let's note the thing of you're pairing with, in this third quote, he says, your offense and your defense must all be done in one motion. He doesn't mean you're parrying and defending with the same weapon. He means that when you break his attack with your dagger, you simultaneously, his face, rapier, arm, and shoulder all lie discovered and open, and you just do a simultaneous attack next to your dagger. And we'll look at what that looks like in a sec. Okay. So part of the reason Swetnam's really easy to remember and really easy to execute in a fight is that he's sort of dividing the world up into a very small set of defensive zones based around the dagger. So none of this is sword centric. This is not inside, outside, above and below the sword, because your sword is not a defensive tool to Swetnam. Your sword is just a pokey thing. I really mean that. So I have fought Swetnam style using a real dagger and a pool noodle as my rapier, because I wanted something long enough that I could reach out and poke people, but floppy enough that I couldn't accidentally forget and use it to parry. Your sword is basically just a point on the end of a stick for Swetnam. And so we have these dagger zones. We have the zone above the dagger. We're going to do one response below the dagger on the left. We're going to do a different response to the below and to the right, and things that happen below the waist. Occasionally there's a response. But by and large, we're just going to be thinking about these 3 zones, and the only decision we have to make as my opponent comes in is which zone is it in, and I'm going to do a defined response to an attack in each of those zones. So if the opponent is coming in above the dagger, we're just going to put our dagger underneath it to lift it up above our head, and we're going to do a counterattack in what an Italian would call fourth, what Swetnam would call knuckles out. And he's going to just do a counterattack to the sword knee, to the arm, to the stomach on that same side. Okay. If the attack is underneath the dagger, we're going to just drop the point and sweep the dagger down, clearing that entire zone, and we're going to attack simultaneously with our sword above the dagger, popping the sword arm, popping the sword shoulder. And this is going to do a couple of things. One is that it's going to make sure that if my opponent were to disengage off the dagger and try to pop up towards my head, my sword is right there to catch it. So I've not only parried his current attack, I've parried basically his most likely second intention too. If he wants to go around the other way, it's much longer and slower, and I have plenty of time to respond. This counterattack next to the sword is also really hard to parry, because his own sword will get in the way. It's as far away from his dagger as possible. His dagger is going to have to cross his entire body to get over there. It's going to be a very awkward angle, and he's going to have to basically go past his own sword to get to that, to parry my attack. It's not a very deep lunge or deep sort of counter that I'm doing here. I'm just going to sweep and take some nice, easy target on that side. Okay. Below and to the right of the sword, so he's going to drop the hilt and sweep across the stomach, keeping the dagger vertical, and we're just going to sweep across. It doesn't matter sort of if his sword is anywhere in that zone, the dagger is going to pick it up, and we're going to throw a counter shot over my opponent's dagger into his shoulder or into his sword arm. If he attacks higher up on that right side, I can parry across and do a low shot underneath. Again, this is great for sort of popping the front knee or the sword arm. And I'm going to try to keep my hilts nice and close together so that if the person tries to disengage off my sword, disengage off my dagger, my sword is right there and can pick it up. Okay. Then below the waist, Swetnam's not too worried about his feet. He generally suggests that if somebody does a foot shot, you're just going to fade back with the front foot. But he does recommend putting your dagger, what he calls, over thwart the opponent's rapier. So if your opponent is lying with his sword down the ground, you're just going to put your dagger sort of horizontally in the path that the sword would have to take to rise up. And you're going to do a counter lunge over the top. You can lunge to the left or the right, doesn't matter too much in this case. You're not necessarily going to make contact with his sword as he comes in, but you're just going to prevent him from popping up into your stomach. And so here's sort of a wheel of defense here. So attack up here, we do a response with our dagger up and our sword below. Attack low on the right side, we drop the dagger hilt, sweep across, and attack over. An attack underneath, we put the dagger on top and lunge over the top. Low on the left side, we sweep down with the dagger and attack in fourth over the top. Or if it's a high shot, we put the dagger underneath it and do an attack in fourth underneath. And these are the stock responses. Swetnam is making it easy to fight easy to remember by having just very standard, very simple, powerful parries that you just pop out on demand. He also spends quite a bit of time talking about defense against cuts. He doesn't actually recommend using any cuts. He actually says at one point, if you have to do a cut, it should be a wrist cut instead of a shoulder cut, but better not to throw one cut in a fight. Instead, what you want to do is just do thrusts. However, he acknowledges that other people do use cuts, including people who use things like staffs and longswords, where you have these large weapons that come in with blows. And his response is doing a slip. Is you're going to back up, let the cut go past, and lunge in. So this is an example of what I would do in response to a cut from my right. Is I'm going to draw back, let the cut go past, and then do a counter thrust while locking my opponent out on that side. And one thing I want to draw your attention to is if you look at my sword hand here, I'm starting off in third with the quillions up, straight up and down. And as I draw back, I'm going to draw back both my weapons and I'm going to pivot my wrist out to the side. Because what I want to do is I want to have the true edge of my sword as a vertical wall, just in case my opponent has more reach than I think he does. And therefore, it's going to smack into that vertical wall, and I'm going to at least be minimally defended. Same thing on the other side. You're going to want to make sure you have your sword edge ready to catch anything that goes too far. Swetnam also really has a really interesting set of double parries, where you're using both the dagger and sword to parry simultaneously. And this is sort of part of his mixed weapons heritage. This is his recommended move against staff, polearm, two-handed sword, or even just someone who's swinging really hard. If you don't trust your dagger to parry by itself, you parry simultaneously with both the sword and dagger in parallel, either held up or down on the left. The version on the right is particularly interesting and fun. So what I'm doing here is I am bracing my sword against the notch between my dagger blade and quillions. And so I'm basically half swording. And I'm blocking my sword, and I'm going to use that whole thing as a unit to block off the attack on the right. And then once I've got a block, I'm going to drop the dagger to push down and thrust forward my sword. It feels sort of like you're making a pool cue shot. It works great, and it's quite effective against people who like to throw big sort of tondos. This is not unique. This particular kind of double parry is not unique to Swetnam. These same things can be seen in silver. You can see even a version in Meyer, among others. It's sort of the solution to how do I use these small weapons to defend against big, strong weapons doing cuts. But again, Swetnam says you yourself should not be throwing cuts. Okay, I'm going to actually pause there for a sec. I know we're on a slight time delay, but if I wait a moment, did anybody have any questions so far before we start getting into offense? Yes? Can I see comments if you make them? I hope you can post them in chat if you can see them here. Okay. All right, I will just keep ranting on. So on offense, Swetnam pretty much assumes that you're only going to go on the offensive when your opponent's weapon is offline, either because they've left it lying offline, high or low, or off to the left or right, or because you've suckered his weapon offline by thrusting off to the side, drawing a big parry, and then stepping in to pick up with a dagger. You're going to target, again, the most convenient non-lethal target. Dagger hand, knee, leg, we're going to snipe, and we're going to kill whatever the... we're not going to try to kill anybody. We're just going to try to scratch him. We're going to draw first blood, declare victory, and we all go home alive. And finally, we're going to keep these very short, discrete attack sequences. We're going to keep space between... Swetnam says you're keeping space between your attacks. And he says, I mean, if thou charge thy enemy with either blow or thrust, recover thy weapons into their place, and draw thyself into their guard again, and so preparing thyself to defend, and likewise make a fresh assault with discretion, but not charge furiously and rashly. So again, we don't want to get too worked up. We don't want to get our bloodlust up. We're going to reach in and do these little dink and get back to guard. Okay, yeah, you have a question. So Chandler's asking, Swetnam still recommends using his true guard even if you have a dagger without a closed hilt. I mean, yes, that is how you respond, is that if your opponent takes a shot at your dagger hand while it's sticking out there and you don't have a nice big guard, his advice is you draw the hand back and reach up to pick up with a sword. That is definitely a workable but second best answer. And he has other guards like his cross guard and forehand guard, which I find, quite frankly, impossible to execute without having a nice big sail guard, because they involve putting your dagger hand sort of dead center right out in front. So you can make his true guard work without it if you have to. But he has other guards that just don't work without a sail guard. Okay, to show you, talk a little bit more about what his offense looks like. So it is basically identical to his defense, but with a step. So on the left, you're going to see me parry an attack to my head and do a counter thrust underneath. On the right, what you're going to see me do is my opponent has just accidentally left his sword hanging out in front of me way too high. So I'm just going to step in, pick it up, and do the same attack. It's the same defensive structure. It's the same counterattack. It's just with a step, I'm moving in. It's whether they're coming to me or going to them. It doesn't matter. It's going to be the same technique. It depends on where his sword is and how I respond. His offensive zones, so he has 3 basic attacks he recommends. The first is a slope stock, where you're going to do a thrust, what we would think of as in 4th, over the sword arm into his sword arm or shoulder or chest. He has a right stock, which is an upwards thrust in sort of 2nd and 3rd, where you're going to thrust up towards the stomach. This is also the shot for sort of knees and taking arms. And he has what he calls imbricata, where he's doing the shot over the top of the dagger shoulder in what an Italian would call first position, knuckles up. So a couple things about this. One, note that he is using, in one case, an Italian word, and in the other cases, he's using anglicized versions, mutations of Italian words. Stock coming from stoccata. He does mention forthright thrusts or straight thrust, where you're thrusting just directly at the chest, but he defines them and then never ever uses them, because he's basically assuming that any straight thrust is going to be picked up by the dagger. And so all of his other attacks are designed to work around the dagger. We're going low underneath the dagger parry, we're going outside the sword where the dagger can't reach, or we're going over top of the dagger. One warning about the imbricata: if you don't use this attack regularly, because of the body mechanics of your arm on that shot, it is very easy to gank somebody too hard with that shot. So do use it. It is a lovely technique that works really well, but be careful with that overhand shot over the dagger. It is really easy to just jack your opponent. So as I was saying, all of his attacks are outside of this dagger zone. And he says, if you feign a thrust inside the dagger, it may be that he will hit the point of your rapier. And once your rapier is picked up by his dagger, you're playing on defense. Exactly, yes. You do want to, if somebody tries to shoot that dagger hand, yes, that's a great time to counter strike. And not trade for a kill. We're not killing. We're going to trade for a better win. And so Swetnam tries really hard to avoid the dagger. All of his shots are explicitly around this sort of orange zone of danger. So he mentions things like thrusting a foot above your enemy's head, or thrusting to your enemy's knee, well clear of that dagger zone, forcing him to make either really big parries or generally get himself in trouble. And Swetnam's feints are not particularly believable. He says specific things like, you must feint a thrust above a foot above his head, or 2 feet wide of his right side, 2 or 3 foot wide of his left ear. And he says, don't step in with your feet when you're doing a feint. So what's going on here is that he's trying to avoid the worst case scenario of your sword being picked up by your opponent's dagger and then having to play defense until you get it free. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make these incredibly safe. We're going to err on the side of safety rather than believability. We're going to do really wide feints, which my opponent is either going to ignore, which is fine, or they're going to try to parry them with a really wide parry and draw their dagger or sword way out of position, giving me lots of space to come back in for a second attack. And I'm going to step in on that second attack after my opponent has already committed to either the wide parry or simply not even reacting. So one of the things Swetnam does recommend is faking a thrust and then stepping in, faking a thrust at a part of the body, seeing if your opponent reacts. If they don't react, throw the exact same shot again and follow through. And it's actually really deceptive. It sounds strange to throw a shot and then just throw the same thing again. But because they just saw that exact shot fall short, they will automatically be slower to react to it when you do it for real. And if you do it nice and smooth, just like shot, real shot, it works like a charm. But again, we're going to stay super safe. We would rather have my opponent not respond than risk having my sword get caught up. Okay, so that is the core of Swetnam's fighting style, is those simple parries and counterattacks that simultaneously become pickups and counterattacks. And so Swetnam's ideal sort of combat rhythm on offense is extend with a feint, the opponent reacts, I pick up with a dagger and make a real attack. So it's feint, pick up, counterattack, feint, pick up, counterattack. It's this nice little 1-2-3 rhythm. It works incredibly well. It's very simple, but very effective. So that's the core of the system, and that is his true guard, which he recommends as being his primary guard. He does list a bunch of other stuff, which is intended to basically mix things up and keep your opponent guessing. So he says there are diverse other guards. They do require more practice to be perfect in, and none of them are any better. But you do have to sort of keep things changed up to keep your opponent guessing, because you don't want to have a standard guard that you're always in and your opponent can learn to predict you. So his alternate guards are a lot of fun. So here's one of them, which is his cross guard, where what you're going to do is you're going to stick your dagger out straight out from your breastbone with your big sail guard protecting your hand and your dagger blade vertically in front of you. And your sword is going to be held well back with a point underneath the dagger. And this is even simpler for defense than his true guard, because pretty much all the attacks are either going to be to the left of the dagger or the right of the dagger. And if they're to the left of the dagger, you sweep left. If they're to the right of the dagger, you sweep right. And you do a counter thrust underneath with the sword. Your own sword is staying sort of loose and free, and if he makes a low attack underneath, you can just sort of beat it down with your sword, or just fade back with a reverse. This works great against Italians. It works great against lefties. This is actually my preferred guard against lefties, because it's so symmetrical that it counteracts a lot of their advantages of coming at you from the side that you're not normally on. And this is an example of a guard where it really doesn't work without a big old piece of metal on the end of your dagger, because you're just not going to be able to defend that hand well enough in this position if you don't have a full guard on the dagger. He also has and I would point out that this picture here on the left is actually a plate from Fabris. So had Swetnam seen somebody fighting Fabris? Is it just or maybe this was just a guard that's in the air and lots of people were doing versions of it and Swetnam happens to also be doing it? But it's a good example of Swetnam partaking of some of the same traditions as the Italians, but from his weird English, in his weird English way. He has a forehand guard where you're going to be similar to the cross guard, except you're going to put the sword farther forward. This is, again, a lot of fun. It is particularly effective for feinting back and forth underneath the opponent's sword and picking a side. So I hate to say it, but Swetnam does explicitly recommend the standard sort of SCA newbie killer move where you sort of just disengage back and forth 50 times and then pick a side and thrust in. That is period. It is in Swetnam. It is one of his recommended techniques. And it works particularly well from this guard where you're relying on your dagger for defense, and therefore you can sort of screw around with your sword nice and loose underneath. One note about this guard is that you really want to he says, keep your point of your rapier somewhat variable. He really means that. It's very easy because your rapier is forward here, it's easier to pick up with your opponent's rapier or dagger. So you're going to want to keep your sword moving, and that's fine. You're not worried about moving your sword out of the guard position because your sword really isn't part of the guard. Your sword is simply hanging out, sneaking up, waiting for a good moment for offense. Your dagger is still most of your defense. Swetnam also has a couple of trick guards. And so there's always talk about bata secretas or secret blows or like secret techniques that masters would have that they would only give to their best students who paid them extra money. And I think his carelessly lazy guard is a good example of what one of those might have been, where what you're going to do is you're going to keep the hilt of your rapier against your right thigh, and you're going to have it pointing off to your left, and you're going to put the blade of your dagger underneath your rapier blade. And so when your opponent comes in looking to take a shot at your open chest, you're going to use your dagger to flick up the rapier in a big... Let me rewind here. So you're going to flick up with the dagger and do this giant sweeping parry off to your left. So he has to be coming in over the sword because you're starting in such a low guard. You're going to do this huge sweeping parry, following up with a dagger pickup and a thrust over top into the shoulder. This guard and the move is a lot of fun. It only works once against any given opponent. So it's fun to pull out once in a while. It will work, but it doesn't work twice. He also has what he calls a broad ward, where you're going to have your sword and dagger at very wide and sort of at or above your shoulder height. And you're going to sort of, it's an invitation for a chest shot. With your intent is that he's going to have to attack inside between your weapons, and you're going to do one big sweeping parry in between and do a counter thrust. This is almost identical to a move in Gigante. So again, is Swetnam copying? Is it just something in the air? Is it just an obvious body mechanic? Up for debate. This again does work really well. One recommendation on this guard is that this isn't a guard where you can just walk out and set up in this guard and the opponent won't fall for it. So the way this guard works is it's sort of like, okay, you're going back and forth, you're sort of exchanging whatever, and you sort of drift into this position. If you sort of act like you're getting tired or getting sloppy, and oh, look, I'm getting slightly wider and wider, and oh, sucker. Works wonderfully. Again, really only works once per person. So that is my talk. That is pretty much the core of Swetnam. Hopefully that is enough for you to dig into the material yourself. One of the great sort of luxuries of Swetnam is that it is in English. I don't know about you, but I don't speak Renaissance Italian or Spanish, so I'm limited to English sources. And this is a case where you can dig into the original manual. It's not a hard read. There's not a complex vocabulary. It's in English. You can just sit down with the original document and get that much closer to the source material. My site with pictures and all sorts of crazy details is up at swetnam.org. There's also a book, Stephen Hand's Swordplay in the Age of Shakespeare, which has an extensive section on Swetnam's single sword, as well as a bunch of stuff on his background and his approach to fighting. So that is the end of my prepared talk. I will wait a little bit and see if we have any questions.